the June 2023 episode of Outline, DLA Piper's regular series of planning law seminars. Today, we are focusing on the tricky topic of Section 106 and having a look at some of the common pitfalls and mistakes that are made with Section 106s that in our experience can come back and bite us when we're trying to carry out development if we're not careful. As usual, the session will run for a maximum of an hour. We'll try to finish within 45 minutes to give some time for questions, but we will certainly be done within the hour. If you have questions, the Q&A function is live, so please do pop your questions in there and we will do our best to answer as many as we can as we go along. And before we begin, if I can just introduce my fellow panelists today. So I'm joined by Pieter Claussen, a senior associate in the team, and also Joe Ward and Gordon Clark, both associates in the planning team. Gordon is here today as the voice of Scotland, as bringing the differences between the Scottish and the English system, because of course it's not called Section 106 in Scotland, is it, Gordon?
No, it's Section 75.
So I will keep saying Section 106, but it means Section 75 in Scotland. And in both cases, what we're talking about is planning obligations. That's the formal name of an agreement that's entered into under Section 106 or Section 75. And perhaps if we can just start with a quick look at the legislation. And Joe, can I come to you for that, please? Could you perhaps just tell us first of all, what can a planning obligation be used for?
Okay, well, good morning. Section 106, well, it's a detailed section that it really sets out the form, scope and effect of what planning obligations are and what they can do. So looking at subsection 1 first, it basically states that anybody who has an interest in land can enter into a planning obligation. And there are 4 reasons that are set out. So the planning obligation can restrict the development or use of land in any specified way. It can require specified operations or activities to be carried out on, under or over the land. It can require the land to be used in a specified way, or it can require sums of money to be paid to the local authority, in certain cases to the GLA, and they can be on specified dates or periodically.
I always think that there's some important limitations there that some people can forget about, and I think we may well come onto a case later that gives an example of where the limits of 106 were forgotten about in terms of covenants. But I think that's a key point. And one of the key points for me is the payments of money. 106 is very clear. It's payments of money to the authority, i.e. the local planning authority, or as you mentioned, Joe, in London, it's the GLA, isn't it? But I think what it can't do is require a payment of money to a third party. So quite often there may be money needing to be paid to a parish council or another body, but under 106, you've got to pay that money to the authority. The authority may then pass it on to that third party, but it's an important point if you're going to keep the agreement within 106 and therefore as a planning obligation rather than just a contractual obligation. But moving on, who can you enforce an obligation against, Joe?
Well, subsection 3 of 106 covers enforceability of planning obligations, and the local authority can enforce against either the person who enters into that obligation, so a party to the original agreement, but it can also enforce against a person who derives title from that person or that party to the agreement. There is a proviso in section subsection 4 that there can be a release clause that provides that a person won't be bound at a time when they no longer have an interest in the land. So that's obviously always something that we look out for. Yeah.
Good point. And I don't think we need to go through them, but there are specific requirements, aren't there? There's some formalities that have to be followed if a document is to be a planning obligation.
Yeah, I mean, subsection 9 sets them out. I mean, the main things are it has to be executed as a deed. That's, first and foremost. It has to say it's a planning obligation for the purposes of Section 106. If it's a development consent obligation, it has to say it is. And then it also must identify the land in question, the person, what their interest is, and that the local authority can enforce.
Yeah. And they're straightforward requirements, but they're important, because if you don't get them right, then it's not a planning obligation, and therefore it's not necessarily going to run with the land in the way that a planning obligation does. So it's always quite important, those drafting, remember those formalities that are there in the section. Joe, just finally, we probably just ought to briefly mention 106 capital A and 106 capital B, which deal with amendments to planning obligations, don't they? Yeah,
section 106A, that's all around modification and discharge of planning obligations. So you can renegotiate planning obligations at any point. Well, obviously you've got to get everybody on side, and there's got to be a will to do that. But section 106A provides that you can ask to modify or discharge a planning agreement, a planning obligation, once it's been entered into. But if there's no agreement to voluntarily renegotiate, the planning obligation has to be over 5 years old. So you'd have to make an application to do that. But it specifically states that you can't modify an obligation, you can't impose another obligation onto somebody against whom an obligation is not already enforceable. So it's always better to negotiate if possible. So you have to go through a process that's set out for in the Modification and Discharge Regulations 1992, and that sets out the information that you have to supply, and you have to provide and submit. And then it really should be determined within 8 weeks, and the authority can decide that it should just be left as it is, so it continues to have effect without modification. It can decide that the obligation no longer serves a useful purpose and should be discharged, or that it can continue to serve a useful purpose, but as modified as per the application. Now, if you don't get the decision either on time, or you don't get the modification that you've applied for, then section 106B gives you an appeal process. So you can appeal where the authority, other than the Secretary of State, has either failed to determine the application on time, or has decided that it should continue without modification. So you've got to make an appeal within 6 months of the date of decision, or the expiry of the period in which to determine. And the appeal should be made to the Secretary of State, and there's no the decision there is final. So that's your last part of call.
I think those two sections are potentially underused, it sometimes seems to me. There's an obvious limitation in that you can't use them in the first 5 years, as you say. You can only amend an agreement by agreement in the first 5 years. But after that, actually, I've certainly used it very effectively where, for example, particularly in housing development, if you've got lots of different owners by the time you need to amend the 106, it can be really complicated in terms of trying to get parties, particularly if you need plot purchasers to be a party for any reason. It can be almost impossible to do it. And one of the benefits of A and B is that actually, if you get your modification, the modification takes effect without the need to actually vary the wording of the document. So you don't need signatories to that document. Yeah. You can do it unilaterally. So I think it's quite a useful power, particularly with that right of appeal. And it sometimes seems to me that people don't use it enough. But that's just my little bugbear on it. So that's the English position. Thank you, Joe. Gordon, it's not quite the same in Scotland, is it? As ever.
As ever, yeah, that's right. In Scotland, planning obligations are detailed in Section 75 of the Town and Country Planning Scotland Act 1997. And in Scotland, a planning obligation is an obligation which does any of the following, and that restricts or regulates the development or use of land, or requires the payment of a specified amount or of periodical sums. Now, up until quite recently, a planning obligation in Scotland had to restrict the development or use of land and may have required a financial payment. But essentially now this change separates the payment obligation from the obligation to restrict or regulate development. And this is likely a response to the Elsick case. That was a 2017 Supreme Court judgment where the court found unanimously that supplementary planning guidance, which required developers to enter planning obligations to pool money into a strategic transport fund, was unlawful. And that was in circumstances where the connection between the development and the infrastructure was trivial. So the Section 75 agreement itself then registered against title and is enforceable by a planning authority against those who signed it and anyone who obtains an interest in the land in the future. We also have our equivalent of 106A, which is 75A, and this provides for the modification and discharge of obligations. So as well as making a formal application to discharge or modify an obligation, we've had a recent amendment, and a modification of discharge can now take place by agreement in writing between the authority and the persons whom the obligation is enforceable. So in theory, complex applications will still require a formal application. However, the new method allows a speedier resolution for simpler applications. And within the same sort of spate of legislative changes, a planning authority itself can propose its own modifications subject to the applicant's consent. And previously, it was only open to the authority to either approve or refuse the application. I think we recently dealt with a modification over a site with a really long and complex history. And I have to say that the planning authority were great in working with us to agree wording which worked for all parties. It could have been a little trickier if all they could do was approve or refuse it. I think it's also worth pointing out in Scotland that we don't have to wait 5 years to modify or discharge the obligation. If the authority aren't minded to grant it, we can take the appeal straight to the Scottish ministers. So yeah, it's just a little bit more flexibility for us.
That makes the power even more useful. So it's even more useful in Scotland than it is in England.
I think that's right. One point to note is we also have Section 75C, which states that an owner is still bound by the obligations even after ceasing to be owner. So the new owner becomes severably liable with any former owner. However, in standard practice, what we do is when drafting the agreement, we'll agree that Section 75C doesn't apply. It's what's known as contracting out of Section 75C.
That's quite an important difference there.
Yeah.
You mentioned the Elphick case, and you talked about the judges concluding that there was a trivial link between it. That probably takes us on to where I wanted to go next, which is the limits and the tests that sit around planning obligations. And actually, Peter, if I can bring you in at this point, trivial has a resonance not just in Scotland, doesn't it, in terms of the case law around what can and can't constitute a planning obligation.
Yeah, thanks, Trevor. It absolutely does, and I think we've effectively got two tests when it comes to Section 106 agreements. It's the de minimis test, and then the Regulation 122 test of the SIL Regulations 2010. So taking the de minimis test first, I think there are actually two sides to that. The first is basically a threshold which is used to determine whether a proposed development is required to contribute financially or provide other benefits to mitigate its impact on the local area. Now, local planning authorities will assess whether the impact of a development is so minimal that it doesn't then warrant the need for a Section 106 agreement. And ultimately, if the impact on local infrastructure, etc., is negligible, then there won't be a financial or other contribution required. Now, as is always the case in planning, whether something is de minimis or not, it is going to be a question of fact and degree specific to the particular development which is being proposed. And then the application of whether something is de minimis or not will obviously vary from authority to authority. But I suppose ultimately every authority is required under Section 70 of the Town and Country Planning Act 1990 to have regard to any material considerations when they're determining an application for planning permission. And obviously, as we've said in countless previous outline sessions, it all comes back to Section 38(6 of the Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act 2004, which requires any determinations under the Planning Acts to be made in accordance with the development plan unless material considerations indicate otherwise. So essentially, if what is being provided in a Section 106 agreement would not be so sufficient so as to amount to a material consideration when you're determining a planning application, then it would be considered as de minimis, and so there wouldn't be a need for an agreement. Now, obviously, that's a rare circumstance, and the flip side of that coin is that if the impact is more than de minimis, then the local planning authority will seek a Section 106 agreement. Now, the second strand to the de minimis tests comes out of a long line of case law, which ultimately culminated in the Supreme Court of Tesco and Dundee City Council. Trevor, that's one that I think you're referring back to earlier. And the basic principle of the Tesco case is that there needs to be a more than trivial connection between a proposed development and the planning obligations sought through a Section 106 agreement. And just to summarise that case, just to give you an idea of what was trivial, Tesco challenged the imposition of a planning obligation by Dundee, arguing that there was an insufficient connection between the proposed development and the requested contributions. And Dundee in that case were insisting that the 106 secured an affordable housing contribution, despite the fact that Tesco were perhaps unsurprisingly proposing a supermarket development that had absolutely nothing to do with affordable housing. So where the Supreme Court went with that is that they found that the link between a supermarket development and affordable housing was trivial, and they ruled that the planning obligations had to have a direct relationship to the proposed development and its impact on the local area. And in that case, the court was really clear, actually, that the planning obligation should serve a legitimate planning purpose and be necessary to make the proposed development acceptable in planning terms. Now that last bit actually segues us quite nicely into the SIL regulations, which I mentioned at the outset, and they provide that a planning obligation can only constitute a reason for granting planning permission if the obligation is one, necessary to make the development acceptable in planning terms, two, directly related to the development, and three, fairly and reasonably related in scale and kind to the development. It's probably also worth noting that those tests are set out in policy in paragraph 57 of the MPPF. So essentially, if a more than de minimis link between the obligation and the development can be established, then there clearly becomes an argument that it's both necessary to make the development acceptable in planning terms, and it goes on obviously to make with the fairly and reasonably related in scale and kind to the development. The arguments sort of start to take care of themselves once you get past that de minimis threshold.
I think for a long time, we just had the Tesco principle. We had that as long as there was a de minimis link, then it could be a planning obligation. And then we had the policy tests in the predecessors to MPPF, and it was a policy discussion then as to whether or not the imposition of a particular planning obligation could be justified. But that bringing it into the SIL regs, I think, was an interesting change to me, because I think the position now is sort of, if I am as a developer, as an applicant for planning permission, if I'm willing to provide you as the planning authority with a planning obligation, then as long as there is that greater than trivial, that more than de minimis link between what I'm proposing to offer and the development that I'm looking for permission for, then I can lawfully offer it. You as planning authority can lawfully accept it, and we can all move on without a risk of challenge. But Reg 122 says that the fact that there's a de minimis connection or greater than de minimis connection isn't enough for you to be able to insist as planning authority on me providing that planning obligation. You have to be able to meet the tests that are set out in Reg 122 in order for it to be a reason for refusal. In order for it to be a reason to approve. So whilst I can offer it, you can't take account of it when you're reaching your decision. And I think probably more relevantly and more often the issue is if it doesn't meet those tests, then, and I refuse as developer, I refuse to provide it, it can't constitute a reason for refusal, and it would be very appealable if the local authority were to turn down a planning application because of the failure to provide a planning obligation that didn't meet the Reg 122 test. So I think that's the area where debate these days is more focused, isn't it? Particularly on appeal.
Well, exactly. I think de minimis gets you into the door, and then it's about satisfying the Reg 122 tests. If it needs to be a reason for granting approval, absolutely. I think another practical point for me on the SIL tests is it's just worth noting that all of the three limbs I mentioned earlier need to be established. You can't just satisfy the necessity test. You need to satisfy all three. It's an and, not an or, in the legislation. So I think just a useful one to take away.
And probably last thought from me on that point is, I think, we regularly see clients who accept things that none of us are convinced satisfy Reg 122 just in order to get a planning permission. That's not unusual, and we all do it. But I think it's always worth bearing in mind, if you find yourself on an appeal, potentially for other reasons, all bets are off at that point in terms of the planning obligations. And it's always worth, if you're on appeal, just going back to the Reg 122 test and actually looking at whether you are still prepared on appeal to offer everything that the planning authority was seeking, or whether actually that's your opportunity to challenge. Because an inspector, in my experience, will take a more strict approach to compliance with Reg 122 than some planning authorities. So no one wants to appeal, but if you're at appeal, it's the silver lining, I suppose, isn't it? Is that opportunity to potentially cut back the 106 and get rid of some of the unjustifiable stuff that you would have been forced to sign up to if you weren't on appeal.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one to bear in mind there on appeal as well is triggers. And certainly one that you and I, Trevor, have done recently in London was where the particular borough was requiring every single contribution or obligation to be provided on commencement. And actually, once you could start to get into the SIL tests, particularly of necessity, well, is it actually necessary to have a travel plan on commencement of the development? Absolutely not. And actually, when you're before an inspector, it does give you that platform to have a rational legal argument, which I dare say you might not have when you're negotiating with local authorities necessarily.
That was a really interesting appeal decision. If anybody wants it, they just need to drop us an email. We'll happily share it. But it was an appeal against Camden, and it was a great example of a number of the things we've just talked about, actually, where if you're being forced to appeal anyway, actually it can be worth challenging the 106, because certainly the inspector knocked out a number of obligations that she said didn't comply with the tests. She took a much more practical, sensible view on triggers and various other details in the 106. So it provided an opportunity to get a much more commercial, sensible planning obligation package than would have been the case if we'd have negotiated it. So it's a good appeal decision to have a look at in this area. But let's move on. I'm conscious of time. Gordon, so you've already mentioned the triviality point, that the de minimis test applies in Scotland the same, doesn't it? But of course you don't have either the SIL regs or the MPPF. So what's the full position north of the border?
That's right. I think pretty much in agreement with Peter's strand one there. But unlike in unlike England, our tests aren't on a legislative footing, so still firmly rooted in policy in a Scottish Government circular. And we've actually got 5 tests that all have to be satisfied. And these are necessary to make the proposed development acceptable in planning terms, serve a planning purpose, relate to the proposed development, fairly and reasonably relate in scale and kind to the proposed development, and bit of a catch-all, be reasonable in all other respects. So, yeah, just not on a legislative basis, but
quite similar. They're expressed differently, but actually it feels as if they're very similar to the policy tests.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Absolutely. On community infrastructure levy, it has been on the books in Scotland for a number of years, the ability to bring this forward, but it's just never been done. The current legislative provision has a sunset clause of 7 years from when the Planning Scotland Act 2019 received royal assent. So I think we're looking at around about July 2026 for the Scottish ministers to have made regulations. Otherwise, this will fall away. But there's no detail have been brought forward yet, so it's still very much up in the air.
That's interesting. We're not going to deal with SIL in England. That will set me off on a rant if we go that way. So with any luck, if the Scottish ministers are wise, they'll just bin the idea as being utterly ridiculous. But But let's move on before I get too ranty. I think next one, really quick, actually, just the perennial debate. When do you use a planning obligation versus when you use a 106? Gordon, what's the position there?
Yeah, English position is MPPF 55, which states that obligations should only be used where it's not possible to address unacceptable impacts through planning conditions. And again, in Scotland, in policy, in that same circular, that it's preferable that conditions are used over obligations.
And I suppose this kind of brings us on. So that's the same in both jurisdictions. If you can deal with it in a condition, the policy presumption is you should. I don't know how many times I've had that debate with planning authorities, but they do love to stick things in 106 or agreements instead, to the frustration of me. And actually, I think this probably brings us on to enforcement, because we haven't talked about enforcement yet. But under 106, there are two ways that a planning authority can enforce a 106. One is by injunction, which is obviously involves an application to the court. The other, if it's works that are needing to be done, is there's a power for them to enter onto the land, do the works, and then recover the cost from those who are liable under the 106, which they can do by charging the land. So they have those powers available to them. But actually, in many ways, those powers, I think, are more cumbersome than if these obligations were in conditions. Because if it was in a condition, they could just have a breach of condition notice. There's no court process required. There's no right of appeal against a breach of condition notice. You simply have to comply, and if not, you're guilty of a criminal offence. So it's always perplexed me as to why local authorities are so obsessed with moving things out of conditions and putting them in 106. Because for me, I'd have them in conditions every day, because then I've got complete control over how I enforce them, and much less cost and time involved with needing to go to the court and get an injunction, or needing to go on and do the works and then potentially have to charge the land and then go through a legal process in order to exercise the charge and recover the costs. That all feels really cumbersome. But local authorities do love their planning obligations, so we will keep drafting them and sticking them in and banging our head up that particular brick wall, I guess. But that's probably covered off enforcement as we go.
Naturally, Trevor, what one of the questions that we've had so far is about the long learnt lesson is that 106 obligation shouldn't duplicate or replicate planning conditions already in a consent, and whether that's still the appropriate touchstone. I think for the reasons that you and Gordon have just articulated, yes, that we still absolutely use that as the touchstone, and so too does the MPPF.
Yeah. There we are. We're answering the questions as we go. Well done. Thank you for that, Peter. And probably my last point on this, which takes us nicely into the next topic, is the other advantage of putting it in a condition is it's enforceable against absolutely everyone, whereas a 106 obligation is only enforceable against those who are liable under the agreement. So actually, there's potentially a broader pool, depending on who the parties are to the 106. There's potentially a broader pool of people you can enforce against with a breach condition notice as well, which takes us nicely to parties. Peter, if I can just come back to you, Joe explains that 106 says any person with an interest in land may enter into a planning obligation. Usually planning authorities want everyone with an interest in the development site to be bound, so that no one can carry out development without being on the hook. That makes sense. But quite often it's not possible. There are scenarios where you simply don't have control of the land. Actually, local authorities sometimes find this when they're looking to secure planning in advance of using compulsory purchase powers, for example. That it's not always possible, is it?
No, it's not. And I think you often see this with large-scale developments where the developer's not yet acquired all of the land interests in a particular site, or where it's just simply not possible at the time the obligation needs to be entered into to tie all of the relevant landowners into the agreement. Now, I think over the years, we've seen quite a few methods of dealing with this particular problem, but to my mind, the neatest and certainly the most legally robust is through the use of what's known as an arsenal condition. So called because it was exactly the situation faced by Arsenal Football Club when they were seeking to develop the Emirates Stadium. Now, essentially, what the Arsenal condition is a Grampian-style pre-commencement condition, which is attached to the planning permission and states that no development can occur until such time that all of the land interests have been bound into a Section 106 agreement. And we would recommend by doing that by way of a supplemental deed, and then you'd have that deed drafted and annex it to the planning permission, so that the permission is clear on its face what the document looks like and how all of the land interests are going to be bound at a future date.
And there's policy support for that in the NPPG in England, at least. But I think the mechanism works whether you're in England or Scotland or indeed elsewhere in the UK. Some local authorities sometimes, when you have that discussion with them, are nervous about it. But there's plenty of authority now that arsenal-style condition can work. The NPPG interestingly says it shouldn't be the default. You should only use it in circumstances, but it does come up, and particularly urban regen schemes is a good example, as you say, when you just don't have control of all of the land. That having that sort of Grampian style condition works it's effective and legally robust as a solution.
And I think actually the exceptional circumstances test almost satisfies itself by the very nature of the fact that you've not been able to get all of the land interests, particularly on large scale developments. That there's normally always an argument that you fall within that exceptional circumstances policy requirement.
Yeah. I think the other aspect of parties for me is the planning authority being a party, and we haven't touched on unilateral undertakings yet, but ordinarily you'd expect the planning authority to be a party, but that isn't necessarily the case, and it is possible for a person with an interest in land to enter into a planning obligation unilaterally, i.e. without the planning authority signing the document. That comes up in various different scenarios, but I think the most common is probably on appeal. If you can't reach agreement with the planning authority and therefore the planning authority refuses to sign the document, then you can do it unilaterally. And actually the Camden appeal that we were talking about earlier, Peter, is an example of having to do just that. So you can do it unilaterally. The difference there is what you can't do is impose obligations on the planning authority in the unilateral undertaking, because they're not a party to it. So they can't be bound up to things like repayment of contributions if they're not spent, or obligations to spend contributions in particular ways. You can't impose those directly. I think it's probably just worth noting, though, it can be done. And again, without wanting to go on about Camden appeal, it was done in Camden, where what you can do is make the payment of a contribution conditional upon the planning authority agreeing to use it for certain things or to repay it off certain time. So there is a mechanism if people are looking to use a UU, but it is important in a particular circumstance to get a reciprocal obligation from the LPA. It's possible. It's a bit complicated, but it can be done. And the inspector was very happy in that appeal that mechanism worked, despite Camden raising some concerns with it, wasn't she?
And I think that particularly comes into play, Trevor, doesn't it? When you need to submit a scheme, because actually on the face of it with a UU, there is no requirement for the council to approve that scheme. And so ultimately that scheme could be submitted, but just sit in the ether forevermore. Whereas actually there are clever mechanisms for binding the council in and sort of having to approve, and if they don't, then there's a deemed approval mechanism in the EU. But yeah, there are ways around it, certainly.
It takes some clever drafting, but it's perfectly possible, and we've got some good authority there in the appeal decision that it works. I think one thing to note with the UU is if you enter into a unilateral undertaking, you can't then amend it unilaterally. So amending a unilateral undertaking requires an agreement, a deed of variation signed by both parties, because ultimately once you've given that undertaking to the planning authority, it's binding unless they agree to vary it. And I think we saw an example in a recently fairly high profile case, the Redrow case that was reported a few weeks ago. That was an example where one of the mistakes Redrow had made there was to try and amend the planning obligation by a unilateral. And the inspector there, as the court said, was quite right to take the view of saying you can't do that. It might have been a unilateral obligation to start with, but once you've entered into it, if you need to come back to it, unless you use 106A, as Joe mentioned earlier, you need to have an agreement with the planning authority to vary the terms of the unilateral. Just one to keep in mind. The other aspect with councils being parties to 106 is it can get complicated if the council is applying for planning permission over its own land. and therefore it is the person with the interest in land that needs to enter into the planning obligation, because as a basic matter of contract law, you can't covenant with yourself, you can't contract with yourself. That's a legal nonsense. So a planning authority is unable to do that. Again, there are mechanisms that get around that. The arsenal condition is one way of doing it if the planning authority is planning on selling the site once it's got planning permission, but before development begins, then you can use the arsenal condition and leave it for the ultimate purchaser and developer to enter into it. And there are other mechanisms as well. I don't think we need to go into them all today. It's just a flag. If the planning authority is a landowner, then thought needs to be given to what the mechanism is going to be to make sure that there's a legally robust planning obligation in place, because it can't covenant with itself. But let's move on. 106 and section 73, we've dealt with this a number of times, particularly a couple of sessions ago when we did the section 73 masterclass. So I don't think we need to do it in any great detail. But Peter, I'll let you talk about your triumph in Norfolk Homes one more time.
Well, I think it'd be rude not to mention it. But in all seriousness, we did cover this in depth on a recent section 73 outline, so I won't go into any detail. But the practical takeaway from that case is that a section 106 agreement doesn't automatically apply to a section 73 permission. Either the original section 106 needs to be expressly state that it applies to any future permissions granted pursuant to section 73, or a separate deed of variation needs to be entered into prior to the grant of the section 73 permission. And I think the key point is that section 106 agreements are contracts. So where they're clear on their terms as to what they purport to bind and do, you can't imply any terms into them, such as a later section 73 permission into the definition of development.
For more detail, look at the outline on section 73 where we discussed it in depth, but it is an important point that still gets wrong. And actually it came up in the Redrow case, although slightly oddly, and it was a different point. I think when you follow it through, the Norfolk Homes principle didn't have application. I think Redrow were trying to push it beyond what it was capable of doing, but it's there and very clear in law. So if you're having a section 73, then a planning authority should be remembering to check that the planning obligation either binds or needs to be varied in order to amend the definition of development. Let's come on to looking at some of the mistakes that people make with 106 and 75 drafting. Joe, these are mistakes. When I say they're mistakes that then come back to bite later on. We see them all the time in the context of if we're looking to dispose of a site and we're trying to respond to the purchaser's inquiries, and there's issues with the 106 that cause problems, or if you're trying to refinance, banks will look at things and if they're not there, then that causes a problem with the ability to refi. And that's probably the first one, Joe. Mortgagee provisions are a common mistake, aren't they? What's the issue there?
Yeah, I mean, as we talked earlier in subsection 1 of section 106, it obviously states that a person interested in land may enter into the planning obligations, and this includes the mortgagee. So if the land is subject to a mortgage, the mortgagee will almost always be required to join in with the section 106 agreement. And as the planning obligations are enforceable against anyone who entered into the agreement or anyone who derives title from such a person, then this catches a mortgagee as a party. And also a mortgagee who acquires title from the freeholder. So when for a mortgage that's in place when the section 106 agreement's entered into, it's important to restrict the mortgagee's liability. So the usual mortgagee exclusion clause states that the mortgagee shall not be liable for any breach of obligations unless committed or continuing at a time when the mortgagee is in possession of all or any part of the property, because obviously, if you're acting for the finance company, you don't want them on the hook for anything else that comes along.
Yeah, and it's critical because banks simply won't enter into them, into 106s without it. And it tends to get picked up when there is an existing mortgagee at the point that the document's drafted, doesn't it? but it can quite often be forgotten about if there isn't a mortgagee at that point. And that then becomes difficult, because if later down the line, the landowner is trying to enter into a finance arrangement over the site, the bank will require that provision there. And if it's not there, then they simply won't enter into it, and you then end up having to go back and try and vary the 106 before you can finance the development. So yeah. It's remembering to make sure the provision is there even when there isn't a mortgagee at the time you're entering into it, in order to make things smoother further down the line is really important. It's similar but slightly different, Gordon, and perhaps I'm going to come to you on this one, and it's particularly around resi development that it applies, I guess, in the main, in terms of plot purchases, but that plot purchaser and indeed more generally statutory undertaker exclusions are quite critical, aren't they?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we've mentioned that non-compliance with the planning obligation can see the planning authority seek to enforce the obligations against successors in title. So in theory, then, that means that purchasers of individual plots or service companies with a long lease who provide services to the site potentially being on the hook for the obligations. So, I mean, I say in theory, I mean, the standard position of most LPAs is that they wouldn't seek to enforce against that sort of party. However, just to rule that one out, standard practice when drafting is just to carve out such end users in the agreement. It's not a controversial point, or it shouldn't be, so it should get through the drafting stage fairly easily.
It shouldn't be. It can be.
Yeah.
Thinking of a negotiation meeting that Peter and I were sat in last week, where it became an issue, much to our surprise, as to whether we were going to exclude plot purchases. And I think, although you're right, in practice, will a local planning authority actually come after the owner of a house for a multi-million-pound contribution? It feels like the publicity wouldn't be great on that. But it is critical for the plot sales process, because ultimately a mortgagee of a plot purchaser will want to see that exclusion, because they won't.
Exactly. I mean, it throws up finance issues for the end buyer, doesn't it?
Yeah. So it's important it's there. And likewise, the statutory undertakers, they won't adopt the services, will they, unless it's clear that they're not taking on liability as someone with an interest in land. So getting that exclusion, that one's never controversial, I don't think. But again, it's important it's there to avoid having to go back and fiddle with it in order to get the estate roads or whatever the utilities and things adopted. I think one that comes up for me on a regular basis is with larger scale development, where it is likely to be developed out in phases, or where it's going to be the ultimate end development is going to be sold off in parcels. It's really important to get the phasing of obligations right, and to be clear, try and link the obligations to each phase rather than having obligations that span the whole development, because otherwise, when you're coming to try and parcel off the site, try and dispose of it, it becomes very complicated, because developers of individual parcels or the purchasers of individual buildings don't want to be on the hook for things that they don't have control of, because they're not buying that phase or they're not buying that parcel. So I think always having in mind what the end ownership structures are going to look like, and then trying to make sure that 106 reflects those structures, whether that's through phasing or otherwise, I think is important. And alongside that, making sure that the joint and several liability which exists is contained, if you can possibly do it, so that there isn't joint and several liability across different phases, because that again it makes it much more complicated to dispose of, much more complicated to charge individual parts, if there isn't that clarity. So I think that's a really important one for me. Peter, I think indexation and interest is another one that people can sometimes slip up with, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's one that's coming up more and more. We're seeing local authorities seeking to index link financial contributions from the date the deed was entered into until the date that payment is actually made, rather than on the date that the payment was due. Now that's problematic, because agreements also commonly contain a provision requiring interest on any late payments under the agreement. So you end up in a position where you're potentially liable for both indexation and late payment interest. So I suppose the lesson there is to be alive to the clause, and if it is in there and you can't get it out, because we are seeing local authorities dig their heels in with it, just make sure that you can meet the triggers for payment of financial contributions, because there is a potential double payment pitfall if you don't.
I think probably one last one for me is thinking about time limits on obligations. Obligations can either be limited in time or they can apply in perpetuity, and particularly thinking about that in the context of obligations around occupation. A good example perhaps is a travel plan. Travel plan will often require that you provide a year's bus pass to someone moving into a unit. You need, if you don't get the drafting right, that obligation could apply forevermore every time someone moves in. So you find, in theory at least, that you as developer are on the hook to keep providing a free bus pass every time the house gets sold and somebody else moves in or a new tenant moves in. So I think being really clear either on what the time limit is for obligations that aren't intended to last forever, or being clear that it's only going to apply on, in that example, first occupation of a unit, not all occupations of units, is important to avoid that lack of clarity as to when an obligation comes to an end and how long the burden is going to exist for. So that's another one to keep in mind. We've got about 10 minutes left, so I want to just come on to some questions if I can, and try and get through some of those. One question that's come through is how long is perpetuity in this context? I'll deal with that one now, seeing as that's what I was just talking about. Perpetuity is forever, so there is no end to perpetuity. Hence the fact you want to be clear, if you're planning on doing something in perpetuity, you need to make sure that you're doing that deliberately and not by mistake. Practical question that's come through: what advice do we have on how to minimise delays when negotiating 106 agreements? Well, isn't a million-dollar question. Peter, you're laughing. Do you have any views?
Well, I mean, it's always difficult, isn't it? Because what the council will say on its website is to go through the formal complaints procedure. Now the problem with that is that complaints procedure is often saying that it's going to take up to 3 months, and by that point, it's too late. You might as well wait for the response to come through. But I think that there are two things for me that we've seen success with, and the first is to send a really stroppy letter and address it to the chief exec and sort of anyone else that might be important within the local authority. That can often gain traction and sort of get solicitors instructed quicker. And then the second one for me is just get everyone in a room and an all parties meeting and make it very clear that no one leaves the room until the drafting is agreed. Now that doesn't always work, but it can be very effective. And I think the way to make that effective is make sure that all of the relevant officers for the relevant contributions or obligations that are in the agreement are in that room and are able to instruct their solicitors. And almost set aside a day, have breakout rooms, let people go off and chat and discuss obligations. But ultimately, the end goal has to be to get an agreed form at the end of it. Now I know developers won't necessarily like that because they're often on the hook for all of the fees for everyone in that room. But actually, when you're looking at 1 day versus a 6-7 month negotiation, it can work out to be more cost effective.
I really agree with that. I think getting in a room can be because the delay, quite often what causes the delay isn't actually anything happening. It's the absence of anything happening. So we can turn around a draft really quickly, but it disappears into a black hole when it hits the local authority, and it's because I suspect in many ways a local authority is under-resourced at the best of times, but there are multiple officers who will need to have a view. That consultation process internally takes an awful long time. And so the reason these things can take a long time is because there are a big chunks of time when nothing is happening. And all we're doing as lawyers for the developer is just chasing. And in fairness, it's quite often we're chasing the council solicitor, and it's not council solicitor. They're just waiting for instructions from others. So it can all become very expensive and very drawn out. And actually, if you can get everybody in a room, you can avoid that because you can make those decisions. You can agree the wording there and then, and you can come out with a document. So it is always worth doing that. Any other thoughts, Joe or Gordon?
No, I mean, I agree with Peter on that one. It's get in the room and hash it out.
Yeah. And I think the other one for me, I would just add, nobody wants to appeal because of the 106. Nobody wants to do that. because it's expensive and it takes time. But actually, 3 years later, when you're still banging your head up a brick wall and you haven't secured your 106, you can't help but look back and think it would have been quicker and cheaper to appeal. So I think kind of if that requires an element of sort of foresight that we don't have as to how painful a negotiation is going to be. But if you're anticipating a protracted approach, then actually don't rule out an appeal. Particularly if you can get to the point where you've got a resolution to grant subject to a 106. It can be a written reps appeal at that point. It's not a quick process, but it can look quick compared to a sort of 12 months plus negotiation where ultimately you might end up conceding things that on appeal you wouldn't have to concede either. So I think in the right circumstances, actually having the confidence to appeal on 106 grounds is not a bad call either. And it always makes sense with the benefit of hindsight. It's just trying to do it earlier in the process, isn't it? We've had another question on monitoring fees and what the position is there. I mean, I think monitoring fees is complicated, isn't it? Reg 122 entertains the idea of monitoring fees, but ultimately, I think it depends on whether the monitoring fee satisfies those Reg 122 tests. And quite often, whether it's reasonable in scale is one to focus on with the Reg 122 tests in the context of monitoring fees. They can be challenged. I think also it depends on the policy background as to whether there's policy support for a monitoring fee and whether that policy sets out how that monitoring fee is going to be applied. So I think the short answer as to whether a monitoring fee under a 106 can be sought is yes, it can, but it has to meet the tests. And if not, there is that ability to challenge if it's unreasonably high. For example, the difficulty is, and there's a few questions around this, what if the local authority won't budge? Well, ultimately, if the local authority won't budge, unless you can get them to budge, you're either going to have to sign it or you've got to contemplate an appeal. There is no other mechanism for getting past a local authority who you think is acting unreasonably. We picked up quite a few of the questions that have come through in slightly different examples. We've also been asked for the case citation for the Camden appeal. I am not going to pretend that I can remember the PINS reference for that appeal decision. It's about 25 digits long. I'm not going to pretend I know that now, but if anybody wants that appeal decision, please do drop either me or Peter an email and we'll happily email you a copy of that appeal decision. We'll also, as always, circulate the links to the various cases that we've talked about today when we send out the recording afterwards. That leaves us with just a few minutes left to go, and I don't think we've got any more questions, although another one just came in. Oh no, we just had a question that says a really excellent session, so thank you to whoever gave us that. It's not a question, but I'll take it anyway. But just in the last couple of minutes, it's probably just worth noting really briefly that other powers are available than 106. If 106 doesn't work for any reason, I suppose the most obvious ones in England, and we quite often see them in 106 agreements, is Section 111 of the Local Government Act or Section 2 of the Localism Act. So if those constraints that you were talking about, Joe, earlier apply, then actually sometimes it's better to do it as under another form of agreement. The difficulty with those is they don't become covenants that run with the land, but there are other powers. Peter, there's also a bit of a peculiarity if you're within London, isn't there?
Yeah, there is, and there was a case relatively recently, which was Kadari and Kensington, where effectively the council granted planning permission to a developer to convert a building into a series of flats, and that permission was subject to a Section 106 agreement, which contained an obligation preventing, we've probably all seen them, any owner or occupier from applying for a parking permit. The Kadaris who actually had an interest in a block of flats where they lived, so brought the appeal, and the High Court agreed with them and found that it was outside the scope of Section 106 agreement. But the council then appealed to the Court of Appeal, who whilst they agreed with the High Court that a parking permit obligation fell foul of 106, and it because the council was seeking to prevent the use of land in which it didn't have an interest, it did fall foul of section 106, but actually there was another power that the agreement was made to, which was the Greater London Council Act, which had a wider scope as to what the borough could do. And so whilst it fell foul of 106, it didn't fall foul of the Greater London Act, and so the council's decision to grant permission was ultimately upheld. So I think the takeaway there is just to keep an eye on the other powers that your 106 is made pursuant to, because they might be wider than you think.
And Gordon, last word to you, because
we've got section 69 of the Local Government Scotland Act. Again, these aren't registered against title, so these tend to be used where there's a requirement for a single payment of an infrastructure contribution, for example. So worth bearing in mind.
Yeah, great. We're at time. We've had a question come through that says, with the last few minutes, can I rant about SIL? I will decline that kind of invitation, whoever asked that question. But perhaps we need to have a SIL session. Perhaps we can have a joint therapy session at some point on SIL that's in another episode.
I was going to say, we did one a couple of years ago, I think, Trevor, and that was quite ranty.
Was it? Oh, that's true. We did.
One-man show.
Yeah.
Yeah, there is a SIL rant available, and maybe we'll do another one at some point as well, just to get it off our chest again. But we are coming up to the hour, and we always do try to finish on time. So if I can just thank everyone for joining us today, and thank you for all the questions. I think we got through them all, but if we have missed some, I think there might still be some coming in. Please do feel free to reach out to us, and after the session, we'll happily answer any questions you have. Thank you particularly to Peter, Joe, and Gordon for taking part in the session today. Our next session is next month, and we will be looking at the equally fascinating topic of environmental impact assessment. So do keep an eye out for that one and register your place. But in the meantime, thanks again and goodbye.